welcoming. There might still be a few people joining us. Nevertheless, I use this time in between to welcome you as President of the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism. My name is Andreas Kilcher. I very warmly want to welcome you to this first ESSWE online lecture, which is an idea that came up a couple of months ago among colleagues of the board of ESSWE. Because of, since the pandemic is forcing us to cancel so many events, we came up with the probably not so original idea that also we could do something online. And the most important thing is that we did it, and I want to emphasize that we are a group of organizers with Christine Ferguson, with Jenny Butler, with Boaz Hus, and myself, and Victoria Laszlo, who did the technical and organizational work. I want to thank you very much for all the work that has been done behind this scene, and I'm really glad that we could get Korshi Dosoo for this first ESSWE online lecture. I'm not going to introduce Korshi Dosoo now, but this is the beautiful task of Jenny Butler, who will lead you through this evening. I just want to thank you for joining us, and hope to see you also in the future events like this. There will be more. Jenny.
Hello, everyone. Just to note that you've probably seen the notification that the meeting is being recorded. So if you don't want to be seen, you can turn off your cameras. So it's my pleasure to introduce Korshi Dosoo, who is a junior research group leader of the project, The Coptic Magical Papyri, Vernacular Religion in Late Antique and Early Islamic Egypt, at the Julius Maximilian University of Würzburg. Formerly a lecturer at the University of Strasbourg and postdoctoral researcher on the LabEx ResMed project, Les Mots de la Paix, his PhD thesis, Rituals of Apparition on the Theban Magical Library, was completed in 2015 at Macquarie University, Australia. His research focuses on magic and lived religion in Egypt from the Ptolemaic to Mamluk periods, as revealed by papyrological and epigraphic sources. So you're very welcome, Korshi, and can take it away. We're all looking forward to hearing more about magical papyri.
Great, so thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to give this talk today. And I apologize, I've got a little bit of a COVID unrelated cough today, so if I occasionally mute myself, that's why. I should perhaps, so I'll share my PowerPoint, and I might turn my camera off just while I give the presentation, then turn it on at the end. So my subject today is, of course, what are the magical papyri? And I phrased it deliberately as a question, and it's a question to which I'm not necessarily going to give a clear answer, but rather I'd like to explore various suggestions of what the magical papyri are, and share essentially some work in progress, some ideas that I've had recently on two kind of interrelated topics. And these are, first of all, a history of the study of ancient magic. So essentially a history of how we look at the magical papyri and how we understand them. This is something which has not really been done, I think, in the field. There's not really a discussion of how it is that we've come to the understanding that we have now. And so it's something that's increasingly been of interest to me. And so I'll try to propose a kind of rough framework, rough history of the study of ancient magic tonight. The second question is one which I think everybody in the field of ancient magic, or who studies magic in general, has to think about, and that is the term magic still useful? And if it is, why do people continue to use it when there's been so much theoretical work deconstructing the concept of magic? And so these two kinds of basic questions, the usefulness of the term magic and what it might mean in practice, and then the history of how we came to our understanding of the magical papyri, are the two kinds of questions which I'm going to explore today in intersecting ways. And as I said, I don't think I'm going to answer the question decisively. I'm really going to explore some possibilities. So perhaps, oh, I'm sorry, before I get to that, I thought I'd do a very quick plug for my website and my project. So you can see our project website there. The URL's at the top. The easiest way to find it, though, is just to Google Coptic Magic or Coptic Magical Papyri, and you'll find it. And hopefully people who find this talk interesting, which hopefully will be most of you, will hopefully also find the website interesting. We have a lot of articles where we discuss similar topics. And although the project itself is focused on Coptic magical papyrological manuscripts, these are really very much connected to the Greek and to the Demotic text as well. And so we do study them all together. And in particular, in our database, which we're working on extensively just now, we actually have entries for all of the Greek and Demotic texts as well. So if you're interested in what I'm talking about, and whether or not you agree with me, this may be an interesting resource for those who are interested in the magical papyri to explore in the future. The magical papyri, what are they? Well, an easy answer, a short and easy answer, is that the magical papyri is a corpus of texts put together in the 1920s and early 30s by Karl Preisendans, who collected together all of what he called at the time the magical papyri. The Papyri Graecae Magicae is the Latin title, the Griechische Zauberpapyri in German. He brought them together with his collaborators. He provided their Greek texts and he translated them into German. And this became a standard reference work. It's often referred to by the abbreviation PGM from Papyri Graecae Magicae. And then very often when people are talking about the individual papyri, they'll cite the number. So they'll say PGM1, which would refer to the first of the papyri collected here. Most of us, well, I think almost everybody in the world today now perhaps encounters it though first through the book on the right, which is the English translations, which were edited by Hans-Dieter Betz in the 1980s. And this was at least my first encounter with these texts. And I suspect it is for most people. It's interesting that relatively good translations of these texts exist in pretty much all of the major European languages. But even speakers of French or German or Spanish often tend to use the Betz edition rather than ones in their own native language for whatever reason. Perhaps it's because the book is widely available and also quite accessible. It has a lot of explanatory footnotes in it, which help out with these texts, which are often quite difficult. And I suspect most people who have signed up for this lecture have probably read the Greek magical papyri at some point. But for those who haven't, and even for those who have, I thought I would maybe talk quickly about one of the rituals. And in fact, this is the very first ritual, which appears in both the Greek edition, the German edition by Preisendans, and the English edition by Betz. This is the first ritual of PGM1. And interestingly enough, it's PGM1 because it's the first of the magical papyri bought by the Berlin collection. It was a German group of scholars, and so they started in Berlin. So PGM1 is the first text in Berlin. After they finished in Berlin, they moved to Paris, and then they moved to London in the sequence, and then it gets more complicated. So this is PGM1, and this is the very first ritual. So it basically describes how to acquire a paredros, which is a kind of familiar spirit, a daimon who will appear to you and carry out your instructions and reveal to you secret information. And the ritual to acquire this paredros was what really made me fascinated with this text from the moment I read it. You get a falcon, and it's not just any falcon. It has the really evocative name, a Circaean falcon, which seems to be some kind of perhaps a peregrine falcon, something like that you'd find in Egypt. You then deify this falcon, which is a technical term meaning to drown. So you drown it, and you drown it in a mixture of milk from a black cow mixed with Attic honey, so high quality honey from Attica around Athens. After you've drowned it, you mummify it, so you wrap it up in linen and papyrus, and on the papyrus you write these two text formations here. So we have two triangles, one which is kind of getting bigger as you go down, and one which is getting smaller as you go down. And these are made up of the Greek vowels. So you have alpha, which looks like our letter A, then epsilon, which looks like our letter E, eta, which looks a bit like H, and then iota, omicron, upsilon, omega. And these are used in a lot of different magical texts that we find from Egypt and from elsewhere. Very often you'll find the triangle that starts big and gets small, and you'll find it on amulets, which are against various kinds of diseases. And the idea is there's a kind of principle of similarity. So essentially you have a disease, you want it to go away, and so you write text which starts relatively large and which gradually gets small, so it diminishes in the same way that you want your disease to diminish. What's interesting here is that you have a diminishing one and an increasing one, and this has been interpreted, and I quite like this interpretation, that it kind of signifies rebirth. The falcon dies, and then it's reborn as a familiar spirit, as a paredros, a god essentially, who will help you out in your rituals. So after carrying out this ritual of drowning and mummifying the falcon, you then set it up in a shrine, you make an offering to it, and you speak a long formula which invokes it as essentially an incarnation of the sun god. And once you've done this, you have the paredros who will serve you. And although this text doesn't really go into details, the following text in the papyrus, which you can see beginning in the second column here, describes all of the various things which a paredros can do. And these are really the whole spectrum of ritual types which you find in the magical papyri. And these include things like divination, finding out about the future and about what people are secretly thinking, healing diseases, cursing your enemies, love spells, so forcing men or women to fall in love with you, spells for good luck or favor in general, and also for a business, and a few other purposes, but these are the kind of principal functions of the magical papyri. So that's what the magical papyri are in a sense, and we could perhaps stop there, having introduced them, but it'd be nice to go a little bit further. And so to take it further, one thing that I think is interesting to do is to talk about where these texts come from. This is, as I said, well, actually it's in Warsaw now, I think, rather than Berlin. It was originally in Berlin, but various things happened, which we won't go into right now, but it's an interesting story how it ended up there. But obviously it wasn't written in Berlin, it wasn't written in Warsaw, it was written in Egypt. And so this is really tied to a larger history of the acquisition of antiquities by Western powers. Nowadays, of course, the humanities are always complaining about being poorly funded. But in the 19th century, the idea of having an extensive collection of antiquities, of having an extensive and prolific classics department or ancient history department was considered something of national importance. And so throughout the 19th and early 20th century, there was essentially a rush to acquire antiquities by the various Western powers. And this was considered, as I said, something of national importance. And this is how most of the papyri that we have, most of the magical papyri ended up in various collections around Europe and sometimes America, and even further afield, rather than being in Egypt now. And when we think about how antiquities get to Europe or America, we often think of excavations, and that is certainly true for some of them. So we see here a photo from the excavation of Grenfell and Hunt in Egypt, and there you can see the various Egyptians who are doing the work of actually digging. This is actually in a site called Oxyrhynchus, more or less in the middle of Egypt, which is a very important site for papyrology. There's essentially all these mounds, which were just outside the ancient city, which were full of, essentially it functioned as ancient dumps. And so huge quantities of scrap papyrus have been dumped there. And among the papyri which were recovered are many magical texts. And you can see an example of one of them there on the right. This is one which is now in the British Museum. It's a very interesting text. It's written in Egyptian, but in Greek characters. It's more or less unique, very poorly understood, but it seems to contain a love spell of some kind, followed by a spell to call upon an angel to appear to you. So similar in some ways to the spell with the falcon that we looked at a moment ago. But the majority of the texts found in excavations like this are very fragmentary. The one that we have here on the screen is actually unusually complete. And in fact, you can see it's broken in the middle here, and there's actually another fragment which is held in Oxford, which they've now realized is part of the same thing. The majority of the big papyri that we study in the context of the Greek magical papyri, and this includes PGM1, were probably found in jars or in boxes, in tombs or in other sites that had been abandoned or in places that had been deliberately hidden. And these are generally not found in formal excavations. but were rather found by Egyptians, who had, of course, learned that Westerners were very interested in buying antiquities. And when they came across texts, either accidentally or deliberately because they were looking for them in tombs, they would go to an agent, a local dealer, who would then contact the agents of various prominent Europeans, and then they would be amassed into large collections before being sold into Europe. And for the magical papyri, the largest and most important collection belonged to an individual called Jean d'Anastasie, who was, well, originally a Greek, even though he tended to use the French form of his name, who lived in Alexandria, who was a very important merchant, close friends with Mehmet Ali, who was the Pasha of Egypt. He amassed the third largest collection in Egypt at the time. It was surpassed only by the consuls of the UK and of Italy, Drovetti and Salt. And he was himself a consul. He was the consul of Sweden and Norway, with whom he was involved with trade. So as I said, he amassed a collection of thousands of antiquities. His collection is particularly rich in papyri. He was very interested in papyri and in ancient writing. And among these, a tiny fraction of the papyri which he sold were magical. And these are the ones which became of interest to scholars as the so-called Theban Magical Library, a collection which seemed to have been brought together by an ancient individual, so some kind of collector of magical and alchemical texts, who at some point buried them or hid them somewhere near Thebes, so modern Luxor, before they were discovered. And then they found their way into the hands of Jean d'Anastasie's agents, who then sold them on in 3 sales to, well, first of all, to Leiden in the Netherlands, then to London, and then finally in an open auction in Paris, where they were dispersed further in other collections. What's interesting about this very early stage of the study of magical papyri, or perhaps even before they were studied, they appeared in catalogues, of course, where they were described to the people who were thinking about buying them. And interesting, what I think is interesting here is that they were often not called magical texts. They were sometimes described as ritual or as astrological, or very often as Gnostic, in fact. And so here you can see the part of the catalogue for the 1857 sale, the open auction, which happened in Paris. It claims that Anastasie found the magical library in his digging at Thebes. This is probably made up. We know from Anastasie's letters that he bought at least some of them, so it's likely that he bought all of them from Egyptians who'd find them themselves. But what's interesting is the way that the texts are described. 2 are described as Gnostico-astrological texts in Greek, and I think elsewhere he describes them as ritual. So the term magic does appear, but the stress is on the idea of Gnostic. So it's the library of a Gnostic Egyptian of the 2nd century. So this early reception of the papyri as Gnostic was quite influential, not just in the catalogues, but even in the publications, in the early publications of the texts. So very often they are published as, for example, the Gnostic Papyrus of Leiden. In the publications, they would refer to them as collections of Gnostic texts. But this was essentially abandoned around the end of the 19th or beginning of the 20th century. And we can see an example of this turn away from the concept of these being Gnostic texts to the idea of them being magical texts decisively here. So this is the edition of one of the papyri which had been split in 2 between Leiden and London. And the authors, Griffith and Thompson, point out that although the manuscript has become known as Leiden Gnostic and London Gnostic, there seems to be nothing in the work which relates specifically to Gnostic systems. Rather, it deals with magic and medicine. And so it seems to be a misnomer to call it Gnostic, just because there seem to be some similarities with the Gnostics. So maybe they picked up some names from the Gnostics, or they had some common sources. And so it was around this time, the beginning of the 20th century, that the scholars decisively turned away from the interpretation of these texts as Gnostic and moved towards the understanding of them instead as magical. And we can see that, for example, in the work of Karl Preisendants in the 1920s. So these are the Greek magical papyri rather than the Greek Gnostic papyri. And of course, this was a period in the early 20th century of the production of corpora. So for example, there were also large corpora of Difixiones, Greek curse tablets, which are produced around the same time, slightly earlier. So what I'm suggesting is perhaps two phases that we can see here. The first phase is the reception of these texts as Gnostic, when we have early individual publications. Then we have their the production of corpora, of coherent corpora of these texts as magical papyri. And this is perhaps the phase which took most of the 20th century. But I think towards the 70s and 80s, we start to see a third phase. And this is the kind of rediscovery of magical texts. So you can see that Karl Preisendanz's work, the Papyri Graecae Magicae, the original edition of the Greek magical papyri, was republished in the mid-1970s, so 1973 to 1974. Around the same time, the huge work of Theodor Hopfner, Greco-Egyptian Revelation Magic. This is originally a work which he'd written by hand. It's an enormous work, I think 3 volumes in the published edition. He'd written it by hand originally. It was also republished in the 1970s. And this revival of interest in the 1970s and into the 1980s seems to be linked to a kind of cultural turn in ancient history. And more specifically, in fact, in early Christian studies. Increasingly, people studying early Christianity were interested not just in the Jewish context of early Christianity, but also in the larger Greco-Roman context. And one very interesting but very controversial example of this is Morton Smith's Jesus the Magician, in which he attempted to demonstrate how looking at the magical papyri alongside the life of Jesus and alongside the Gospels might reveal certain aspects of the way in which Jesus carried out his miracles and the way in which was understood by his contemporaries. And of course, the kind of watershed in this kind of new phase of study of magical texts, I would suggest, is the English edition by Hans-Dieter Betz. And this too was part of the this too was linked to Christian studies in the sense that it was published in the collection, the Corpus of Hellenistic Texts for the New Testament, Corpus Hellenisticum Novi Testamenti. So it's explicitly published as a reference work for scholars of early Christianity. What's interesting is that if we look at the way in which this impacted publications, you can actually see, this is basically from the database Année Philologique, which gathers together well, it's supposed to gather together all publications in the field of classics and adjacent fields. You can really see this huge explosion in the number of publications mentioning magic from the late 70s and early 80s onwards. It looks like this has declined recently, but I don't think that's really the case. I think that's just because their database is less complete. And if we look at Google Scholar, you can see the same thing. There's a slight blip in the use of Greek magical papyri in the 20s and 30s, that initial stage of the publication of corpora. And then here, and probably around the time that we see the publication of the Betz edition, we see an explosion in the interest in the magical papyri. This kind of new wave of interest in the magical papyri also came with a theoretical aspect. So it was not just a renewed interest in the magical papyri, but a renewed interest in what they meant and how they could be understood. And part of this renewed interest involved looking to anthropology and looking to sociology for the first time for theoretical perspectives in which magic could be understood. And within anthropology, by this time, magic was understood in a very specific way, and it had generally been abandoned. So the concept of magic had, of course, been very important early in the study of anthropology, with figures like Durkheim and Fraser and Mauss and Hubert using magic as a key concept. But by the time we come to the 60s, as you can see in the work of Murray and Rosalie Wax, this kind of the idea of magic as a cross-cultural category, and in particular one which could be placed within this Fraserian trichotomy of magic and religion and science, had very much fallen out of favor. Essentially magic was often counterposed to religion and science in a negative way. It was irrational, it was superstitious, it was very much linked to a Western and Judeo-Christian context. And because scholars eventually said this is a very ethnocentric category, we can't really fruitfully apply it to non-Western concepts, there's an increasing move from the 60s onwards to abandon the use of magic as a cross-cultural category of analysis. And so it was this anthropological attitude to magic which the new wave of magic studies really inherited. And one of the main scholars in this movement was Jonathan Z. Smith, formerly of the University of Chicago. And he wrote a lot of very influential and really excellent works. particularly in the 1990s, but also in the 1980s and early 2000s, in which he kind of interrogated the way in which magic was used and could be used and should be used in relation to the ancient, the evidence for ancient, what had previously been called ancient magic, and in particular magical papyri. And so here you can see a fairly typical example of the argument that he made. He essentially suggests that magic as a kind of academic term really wasn't of any use. And in fact, it could end up confusing our attitude to the material. And we were better off using more generic terms, for example, healing or divination or execration, that is cursing. And there'd be no cognitive loss, but instead there would be increased clarity in the kind of material that we were talking about. We'd be able to talk about it in a clearer way without the term magic confusing the discussion. So this essentially demanded a new understanding. If the Greek magical papyri were not really magical, what were they and why did they deserve to be studied together? And one of the approaches which I think has become probably influential, very influential certainly, and perhaps even normative, is an approach which kind of returned to the materiality of the papyri, and in particular returned to the Theban magical library as a context from which the kind of broader context of ancient magic in Egypt could be understood. And so here is another one of the papyri from the Theban Magical Library. It's known as PDM / PGM 14. And you can see this abbreviation PDM. This stands for Papyri, Papyri Demotikai Magikai. So these are not written in Greek, or not entirely in Greek, but rather in Demotic, which was a late form of the Egyptian language. So of course, Greek was widely used in Egypt from the 4th century onwards, when it became part of Alexander's empire, and then it became the property of his Ptolemaic successors. Greek was the main administrative language. It was the language of the ruling class, and it remained the administrative language until the 7th century, when the Umayyads decided to replace it with Arabic. So Greek was a very important language, but Demotic, as a written form of Egyptian, existed alongside it for several centuries. But what happened in the Roman period, and it's really due to various, it seems at least, various arcane administrative reasons, is that Demotic ceased to be used in daily life. Essentially, it fell out of use in letter writing in most contexts and for writing up documents, and it became wholly restricted to the sphere of religion. And so the only people by the Roman period and by the 2nd century that we're talking about who could write in Demotic would have been priests. And so in the Theban Magical Library, we find not only Greek texts, but you also find text written in Demotic, which you can see here, and we find Greek and Demotic even mixed together. So here we have a ritual which begins with the heading and instructions in Demotic. It switches to an invocation in Greek, and then it returns to Demotic to give us more instructions. So we can see the two languages are really very much intermingled with one another. They're completely intermeshed. And this suggests that the person who used this text was actually an Egyptian priest. And so for the first time, well, not for the very first time, but this seemed to suggest some kind of lived context for these texts, removed from the more abstract concept of magic. And so this thesis, the idea that these are understood not necessarily as magical texts, but rather as texts produced by Egyptian priests in the Roman period, was really developed by several authors, including Robert Rintner, of course, played a very important role. But perhaps most influential in subsequent scholarship has been David Frankfurter, who wrote some really excellent and very thought-provoking articles. And of course, Religion in Roman Egypt is a great introduction to the religious landscape of Roman Egypt. And in this book and in subsequent and preceding articles, he essentially argued that what the magical papyri represented was Egyptian ritual, which had been brought into a new context. So once again, for fairly boring administrative reasons, which ended up having fairly concrete material consequences for the Egyptian priesthood. The Egyptian temples were in a state of collapse essentially by the 3rd and 4th centuries. So they were no longer, so priests would no longer perhaps be able to achieve an income through their work at the temples. And so Frankfurter suggested that instead what they started to do was to market their ritual expertise, their temple rituals, in the private context. And it was in this shift of context from the temple sphere to the private sphere that they became viewed, in the eyes at least of the Roman government, as magicians and as practitioners of magic. And this, I think, represents, to some extent at least, the kind of normative understanding of magical papyri at the moment. Yeah, so Bernd Christian Otto, another scholar very much worth reading, who has examined the historical development of the magical papyri, essentially draws upon this, and he observes, as many other people have observed, that the later Coptic papyri, so these are papyri written in Coptic, a later stage of the Egyptian language, but generally from a Christian context. He observes that these papyri often contain similar content to the older Greek and Demotic papyri, and this demands explanation. And so the explanation that he suggests, drawing upon Frankfurter, is that some of the Egyptian temple personnel, the priests, joined Christian monasteries. And as they did so, they took their ritual texts with them. And so this transfer of tradition can be explained by kind of transfer of personnel. Egyptian temple magic becomes Christian monastic magic, essentially. So what I've kind of presented is so far, and so here's a nice example of it actually. So here we have an early Greek magical papyrus, this time not from the Theban Magical Library. And we have a magical name, Ablanathanalba, which appears quite a lot. I don't think we really know what it means. But one of the nice things about it is that it's a palindrome. You can read it the same way forward and backwards, because th in Greek is a single letter, theta. This actually appears very often in amulets. Sometimes you have it as one of these decreasing triangles to heal a disease. And here we have a Coptic text where somebody has, it seems, tried to copy a name which probably started out as Ablanathanalba, but it's no longer a palindrome and it's barely recognizable. Instead of Ablanathanalba, we have Ala, Fla, La, Ma, Tha, Tha, Iotha. So you can see that there has been some kind of transfer, but at the same time, perhaps a loss in meaning in this process of transmission, which is actually something which we find quite often in these corpora. So at this point, I've kind of suggested that we can break down perhaps the history of the study of ancient magic into 3, maybe 4 stages. The first is the kind of Gnostic reception. The second is the magical reception and the building up of corpora. And the third is this kind of new wave of interest in magical texts from the 70s and 80s onwards, in which we start to see the absorption of critical perspectives from anthropology and sociology, and ultimately a new understanding of these texts as essentially ritual and priestly texts. But what I'd like to at this point is to perhaps return to the criticisms of to 3 of these moments, and perhaps examine them a little bit more closely to reveal aspects which I think are often missed, and which I think problematize a little bit some of the ways in which these texts are often understood. So first of all, when we look at the Gnostic moment or the Gnostic reception of the magical papyri, it's important to observe this wasn't kind of an original move to call these texts Gnostic. It was actually following on from a tradition which had been going on at least since the 18th century of referring to these objects as Gnostic gems or as Gnostic stones. So these are essentially amuletic gems which were produced in the Roman period, maybe the late Hellenistic period as well, so around the turn of, so around before and after the period which we arbitrarily assign the birth of Jesus to. And so you can see a fairly typical example. This is kind of one of the prototypical figures, right? This rooster-headed figure with a whip and a shield with snakes for feet, known in scholarship as the Anguipede. And on the back, you can see a name is written, and the name is Abrasax. So this is a very famous name, and in fact, the name Abrasax is often associated with this figure. But the name Abrasax was known before the discovery of these figures, and before the discovery of the magical papyri, in which the name Abrasax also appears. And it was known from the writings of the Church Fathers, who talked about various Gnostic heretics. And in particular, Abrasax is known from the description of Pseudo-Hippolytus of the Gnostic system of Basilides. So when early modern European scholars discovered these gems and discovered the magical papyri, they interpreted them within the framework which they had, which was the framework provided by the texts preserved from the Church Fathers, which described what they were seeing. They described these strange names such as Abersacs and strange figures with the heads of animals within Gnostic systems. They put two and two together and decided that these were gems produced by Gnostics. And there were certainly very striking similarities between these so-called Gnostic gems and the magical papyri. So here is an image from PGM2 plus PGM6. This was actually probably produced in a very similar context to PGM1 with which we began. And it's a figure who has two objects in his hand, perhaps some kind of staff and perhaps a laurel wreath. And he seems to have 5 small snake heads or something like that. In fact, they're probably not small snake heads. They're probably droplets of blood which are spurting out from a decapitated neck. So this is a figure often known as the Akephalos or headless god. And we find the same figure, in fact, in the magical or Gnostic gems. So here you can see a figure who is crouched, sitting on top of a lion. In his hands, he holds 2 objects, a flail and perhaps a scepter. And you can see again these little snake-like droplets of blood spurting out from his headless neck. So the first authors, who include this gentleman, Caspar Ruyvens, the director of the Leiden Museum of Antiquities, they were not entirely wrong when they called these things Gnostic papyri, in the sense that they did have clear relationships to the Gnostic gems. And in fact, they also had relationships to the Gnostic groups, at least as they were described in the texts which they had at the time. So they didn't have the Nag Hammadi library, of course. All they had were the writing of the Church Fathers and the writing of the Neoplatonists, who talked about the Gnostics as carrying out various magical rituals. And in fact, that's what's quite interesting about Letron. So, sorry, just a quick side note. The first person to write about the magical papyri in any context was Caspar Ruyvens. So he was the person who was the director of the Leiden Museum of Antiquities. So he was the first person in Europe to see them after they were purchased by the museum. And he discussed them in a work called Lettres à Monsieur Letron. Ostensibly, these letters were about this very goofy-looking owl, which had also been acquired by the museum at around the same time. But he actually spends very little time, at least in the first few letters, talking about the owl. And in fact, he talks almost entirely about the magical papyri. And so what is interesting is that he does definitely think of them as Gnostic. And in fact, he not only thinks of them as Gnostic, but he tries to link them to a particular Gnostic system, and that is the Gnostic system of Marcus, the Marcosians. But he has some relatively understandable reasons for this. He notices that they often play around with vowels. So in our very first text, we saw that there were these triangles formed from the Greek vowels. According to Irenaeus, who is our chief source for the Marcosian Gnostic system, they had a considerable interest in the vowels as well, and they also had an interest of mixing Greek and Egyptian elements. And so Letron, again, using the material at his disposal, tried to understand these texts, and he understood them as the productions of a Gnostic group. But what's interesting is that he didn't understand them as necessarily Gnostic in opposition to magic. Rather, he seems to have understood them as magics. You can see here he talks about them as 2 magical rituals. But rather they were 2 magical rituals produced by Gnostics. So this is perhaps an interesting precision to make. They were not Gnostic and not magical. They were both Gnostic and magical. That is, magic could be produced and used by different groups. And in this particular context, he thought of them as being produced by Gnostics. And of course, we don't believe that anymore. And I think that the scholars at the end of the 19th century and 20th century who rejected that hypothesis were correct to do so. But the fact remains that there is a very interesting and intriguing relationship between the magical texts and the Gnostic systems, which I think is still not completely understood. The second point I'd like to raise is the labeling of these texts as magical. And in the kind of third wave of magic scholarship, the term magical was rejected because it was seen as being in opposition to religion and science. But what's interesting is if we look at the scholars who kind of put together this magical corpus, the Papyri Graecae Magicae, we actually don't really see any clear hint of this. Rather, they seem to have considered the study of magical papyri as clearly a part of Religionsgeschichte, so the study of religious history. And we don't see, at least in the work which I've been able to find, any clear reference to this kind of new emerging idea within anthropology that magic was intrinsically opposed to both science and religion. This doesn't mean that they necessarily respected the magical papyri. As President notes here, many of the earliest scholars who studied the magical papyri were looked down upon and had to justify their decision to look at such uncultured material, but was nonetheless not clearly differentiated from magic, from religion. And what's interesting is that, as Jan Bremer has pointed out, this idea of magic and religion being inherently opposed to one another is something which seems to come principally from the work of James Fraser, of course. And as Jason Joseph from Stormers pointed out, this is something which is not even just from Fraser, but in fact specifically from the second edition of the Golden Bough, which appeared in 1900. So if we look at Google Ngram, we can see that the phrase magic and religion doesn't really take off until 1900 with the publication of the second edition of the Golden Bough. So that is to say, this distinction between magic and religion wasn't really in place when the papyri were first described as magical in the 19th century by scholars such as Caspar Huygens. So once again, rather than a kind of dichotomy, Gnostic or magical or religious, I think we should understand the early scholars as understanding them as both, even if their understanding was not necessarily the understanding that we have now. So to come to the last point, the idea of these texts as fundamentally the productions of an Egyptian priestly class, or as a translation of Egyptian priestly ritual into a new context. So it's certainly true that the vast majority of the papyri that survive come from the 3rd and 4th centuries, which is the period in which the Egyptian priesthood and the Egyptian temple system was on the decline. But in fact, this might be partly an illusion caused by the survival of these very large archives, the Theban Magical Library and a few other ones which date to the 3rd and 4th century. In fact, if we look at this diagram, so it's a diagram of the surviving magical formularies, the big handbooks containing recipes. And if we look specifically at the Greek language ones, we can see that the earliest examples appear around the 1st century BC. And this is long before the temple systems were in any kind of trouble. And we can see they continue to be produced in the 1st and 2nd centuries, when again, there's no clear financial pressures on the majority of Egyptian temples, at least as far as we know. And these early texts, although they're often very fragmentary, they don't come from the nice big collections that we have from the 3rd and 4th century, but they often are very clearly of a similar type. They contain the same formulas, same structures, the same scribal habits, same abbreviations, for example. And at least for me, this really problematizes the kind of historical narrative, the very nice historical narrative, which Frankfurter seemed to notice between the appearance of these magical texts in Greek and the collapse of the temple systems. It seems to me, at least, to say that there's no clear relationship between the two events. The second point is, if we look again more closely at the Demotic magical texts, we might imagine that they represent a kind of purer form of the Egyptian rituals, which were later translated into Greek. But the interesting thing is, so we have here an example of one of the Demotic magical papyri. We have a section which is almost purely Greek, but you can see here they've inserted the Greek vowels a, e, o, u, o. So the exact same vowels that we had in our first text. Now, these are not the vowels of Egyptian. People often say that Egyptian didn't have vowels because they're not written in the native writing systems. But Egyptian is an Afro-Asiatic language, so like Hebrew and Arabic, to which it's distantly related. It uses a consonantal structure, and so it's not necessarily worth writing the vowels. Somebody who knows the language can usually guess what they are from the consonants. So this adoption of vowels, and specifically the Greek vowels, into the text, into a magical text specifically, seems to indicate this is not a purely Egyptian ritual, but rather it is one which is influenced by an older Greek magical practice. Not necessarily a lot older, but at least it doesn't represent a pure Egyptian ritual. Rather, it represents a borrowing from Greek sources in this case. And this is what we tend to find in the magical papyri. It's actually very difficult to assign any particular cultural origin to their practices. We see a lot of mixture, a lot of things which could be either, a lot of things which are clearly either Greek or Egyptian or Jewish or from another source. But understanding their cultural origins and background is often a lot more complicated than just assigning them to one origin, like Egyptian, even in the case like this, where they're written in Demotic. Another problem is that the Egyptian magical texts, the Greek magical papyri and Demotic magical papyri, are often very close to material which we find from outside Egypt, so other parts of the Roman Empire and other parts of the Hellenistic world, and often very distant parts. So this is a very interesting lead tablet, which was discovered in Tonquès in Belgium and just published last year. And you can see that it actually has a very close resemblance to this one of the magical papyri, PGM7. You can see that they both have, this is typically called a stela. It's a kind of representation, a kind of figure, which is intended to be copied onto an amulet. This is a curse tablet, so it's for a different function. But you can see it uses very similar imagery. We have this little triangle shape, this almost pyramid up here. We have what look to me like little faces peeking over it, and we can see an example of one of them here. These characteras, you can see there's an identical character here and here. And the other characters around the perimeter are very similar. And so you see very similar practices, very similar visual language being used in texts which are produced hundreds of years and hundreds of miles apart. And in particular, this one, found in Belgium in the 1st century, attests to the fact that we actually have a very similar practice outside Egypt at the very beginning of the Roman period. And so once again, it seems difficult to imagine that if we have people practicing this kind of thing in Belgium, that we're dealing with a purely something which is purely the province of Egyptian priests in the 4th century. Rather, I think we're dealing with a larger tradition, whether we want to call it magic or something else, which is really spread across the Mediterranean and the Roman world more broadly, and of which the Greek magical papyri are one particular manifestation. So how do we understand this tradition, which is attested by the Greek magical papyri and by other material objects, is not an easy question. But increasingly, I've been interested in the fact that, well, the magical papyri, we should say, don't give us a lot of help here. They're not theoretical texts, they're practical texts, so they don't really go on long disquisitions about how they understand themselves, how they are to be understood. But in very few cases, we do seem to catch glimpses of how the practitioners imagine their practice. And we find one of them in PGM1 by coincidence, so the papyrus with which we started. And it's talking about what you should do when the Paredros appears to you, when your familiar spirit appears to you. And when he comes, he tells us you should ask him about whatever you want, about divination, divination with epic verses. So this is using the text of Homer to divine the future. Dream sending, so sending dreams to people to persuade them to do what you want. It's a little bit like an ancient version of Inception. Dream interpretation, and striking down people with sickness, so causing disease, and about everything that is part of magical craft. The term he uses, magike emperia. So what is interesting is that here he seems to be the author seems to be describing more or less, well, not in totality, but he's describing a fairly broad swath of the typical practices of the Greek magical papyri. And when it comes time to qualify how these are to be understood, when he comes to give the overarching description of them, he describes it as a craft, an emperia, which is magical, which is magike. And so to come around in a circle, I actually wonder to myself now if the Greek magical papyri are just that, Greek magical papyri. But of course, that raises the question of what do we mean by magical? And so perhaps, well, the direction that my research has taken me now is to examine more closely what magike would have meant to somebody of the 2nd century, which is, of course, not necessarily what it means to us now. It's 11 years, I think, since I first looked at that ritual involving drowning the falcon in milk. And 11 years is a long time, and I can't really remember whether, when I first read it, that was what I thought of as magic or not. So yes, what are the differences between magike then and magic now? That's perhaps one question to consider. So thank you for listening to my thoughts, which, as I said, is really work in progress. And I very much look forward to hearing your comments and questions.